Well, I'm excited for the conversation that we're going to have today because one of the things I've noticed is whenever we bring you experts or founders or other investors, you guys give us really great feedback here at Startup Growing Houston about how it helped you where you were then. And because I will deeply listen to what they say, Elaine, so many times I'm hearing, especially our women who've been coming and doing things with Startup Growing Houston for 9 years, when and where they're not heard or they're feeling silent. And so when I met you on LinkedIn and I heard about the genius that you bring in that space, I was like, oh, I know a lot of people are going to want to hear what she's got to say.
Thank you.
So I'd like to ask you, can you start us off by giving us a little bit of an arc of what's been your journey to get you here where you are now?
Yeah, I will say that I think I'm a lot like most of us, which is we go into life thinking there is a linear path that we're going to take, and we're going to take that next step and take that next step, and it'll get us to where we want to go. And I think that's accurate, but there's a lot of twists and turns and a lot of the game board of life that you don't actually know how the path is going to go. So I started out thinking I want to be a lawyer. That was a pretty solid choice. I decided that when I was 11. And my reasoning at the time was if you understand legalese, if you understand the law, you speak a different language, essentially, and that opens doors. Pretty good for 11, if I do say so myself.
Really good for 11.
Thank you. So then I ended up at Harvard Law School intending to be a litigator, at which point I came across negotiation theory and pedagogy getting to yes. So what are the things that really matter to each of us? Interest-based negotiation, how do we build options and outcomes based on those interests rather than positional bargaining, which is what we tend to see in negotiation. And I was fascinated. I grew up in a family, perhaps like many of us do, that didn't really talk about things. It wasn't allowed. You're not allowed. Who's allowed to negotiate with your parents, with the people who have more power in your life? Yes, ma'am, right? You are supposed to listen and comply. Now you might know why I have written a book about silence. But I threw myself into that world, which ended up not being law, but being called leadership development. So for the last 10, 12, I've lost count of the years, I have been facilitating leadership development workshops, doing keynotes in the areas of communication, collaboration, and conflict management. Essentially, the question of my life has been, other than sue each other and blow each other up, what can we do? Turns out quite a bit. And as I was teaching that theory, that pedagogy, those skill sets that came out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, I kept noticing, people pay a shit ton of money to go to an executive education program, and it's a good one, world-class even, and yet some people still don't negotiate, still don't have the difficult conversations, still don't give and receive feedback. Why is that? And my response was silence. It is the silence that we've learned, the silence that we have often benefited from, the silence that prevents us from actually doing the things that we think and we might intellectually agree would be useful for us to do. But because we are so used to staying silent, staying small, denying our own needs and interests, wants, hopes, dreams, to make that leap from the unconscious, this is how I operate in the world, to, oh, I need to now advocate and negotiate and put myself out there. That's a really big leap. And silence is this unspoken force that keeps us small. So my perspective is that until we solve for silence and unlearn what has become habitual, we're going to be held back by it. because the people around us also continue to send us those messages, particularly if you are female or identify as female, particularly if you have a non-white racial identity, any of these subordinated identities, sexual orientation, class, education. If you don't hold that dominant identity, the world and the people around you and the traditional systems tell you, here's the box that you fit in, stay in it. And if you try to get out of it, you're penalized. And so we are constantly being silenced. But that's not how the problem statement is presented to us. It's presented as, you need more confidence, get over your imposter syndrome, have more courage, right? Courage only takes you so far when the rational calculation and the irrational calculation is, hell no, right? I cannot stomach that cost. I do not want to bear that backlash. I do not have any sense of dignity today. Why would I sign up for more? So that's how I got here, which is the advice that everybody else seems to be doling out of just speak up, just do it, felt wholly unsatisfying and frankly irresponsible. And so I'm on a mission to figure out how do we unlearn the ways we silence ourselves, because we certainly contribute to it by perpetuating the things that we've learned over time and benefited from over time. And how do we as human beings, as team members, as family members, as community members, stop silencing the very people that we claim to support? How's that for a path?
Now you guys know why I am Elaine Lin Hering to the mic this month.
Thank you.
If we stopped right there, that's probably more than what most people have absorbed in a while.
To be clear, it's a lot to absorb, right? It is a paradigm shift that says, oh, the ways I've been operating might not actually be aligned with how I want to show up in this world. Oh, shit. And a lot of people don't want to reckon with that. Most of us want to see ourselves as the well-intentioned leaders, co-workers, family members that we see ourselves as. And that willingness to acknowledge that I might not actually have the impact that I intend is really hard to do. And yet so necessary.
One of the things I'm hearing in that, and few people are willing to talk about, is that wanting to appear good, wanting to appear positive, wanting to appear helpful. It's a very subtle, yet when you're able to turn the corner of that and recognize how it controls you and how it's not actually beneficial for you to keep showing up that way, that you end up contributing to part of the problem why others are silenced.
And that you're actually creating toxicity. In that false niceness. And this is definitely cultural, and there are pockets of the United States and pockets of the world, cultures that say you need to be nice, you need to be kind, you need to show up in a certain way. And so there's pressure to do that. The question is, how are we going to show up in the midst of that? What choices are you going to make? I tend to operate from the stance that each of us are flawed human beings. I am messed up. I am broken. I don't have everything together. And the humility that comes from that, and the freedom that comes from that, to say, oops, screwed that one up, and to own it, rather than to try to cover it up and say, oh no, but I'm a good person. That disconnect, that cognitive dissonance just adds salt to the wound. So if you mess up, you own it, and then you learn from it and you move on. How healthy a world would that be, rather than the behaviors I've seen, and I'm sure you've seen or experienced, where I screwed something up, because I need to reconcile that with the good identity that I hold, that identity story I hold in my head, then I'm like covering it over with niceness or pretending it didn't happen or gaslighting. It just makes things worse.
Yeah, because we've also been conditioned that if we don't do things to cover up those mistakes, that, God, there's too many to choose from for me to fill in that blank. I'm going to leave that for everybody to fill in their own head.
Yeah.
So I didn't even ask the first question, and you've already answered it. And that
I love it.
with my interviews. That's so funny.
I love that.
That's so funny. Oh, because sometimes when people tune into Startup Grind with us, it might be the first time they've ever listened to what we're doing, because we're kind of doing something really different than other chapters. We're relying on a different skill that I have, because I used to have a global business radio show for almost 10 years. And so when putting our stake in the sand of how we were going to do things differently as a chapter, and then making that proclamation of how we're only going to give women, Indigenous, Black, Asian, LGBTQIA2, and neurodivergent voices the mic, the underrepresented voices. I knew that the only way I was going to be able to tap into those voices is if I didn't try to do the traditional boots on the ground, face-to-face kind of interview that we've done for the 8 years before COVID happened. And so bringing it back around to more of a global business radio show allows us to tap into all of those really great voices like yourself, because you're out in California, and we would have never had the funds to fly you in to talk to everybody. So this is a great way to tap into brilliant minds in a really different way. Oh, one of the things that I recognize in your work and around leadership and silence is a big piece that some people hear. So we're back to that whole intellectually I hear it, but I don't necessarily know what to do with it. That's a lot of what I hear from clients is unlearning.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what's the difference in the value of unlearning? Because there's so much around it.
Yeah. And using the phrase unlearning has the potential of being, it's a catchphrase, or we're trying to do so. It feels false, some bad marketing slogan. But for me, it's really an acknowledgement, as you've said, that we have all been conditioned in different ways, starting from our families of origin, our formal or informal education, from what gets rewarded in a workplace or on a team or in a community. We've been conditioned. We have internalized lessons about how things work, who gets to speak, who's going to have power, who's going to be rewarded, who's going to get their hand slapped. And all of that is typically invisible to us. And many people walk into a new culture and say, I have no expectations, to which I say that's BS, because we all do. It is in our bodies. It is ingrained. Some people might even say you're indoctrinated. And frankly, you have to be to survive in many of these cultures, because that's how things are done here. And so to say, well, let me just take that, here's my baseline of conditioning for years and years and years and decades, and then let me learn a new skill on top of it. Well, if this foundation has different assumptions and norms that are often unconscious, that is not solid ground that you are learning or building on. And so unlearning is, how do we strip that down? Not to say throw it all out the window, but really interrogate, what have I learned? over time? What have I internalized about what I think is right and wrong, about how things work around here, about how I want the world to work? Have I even paused to think, whoa, what do I want? Because a lot of silence and learned silence is, as women, as people with less power in hierarchy or in communities, your orientation is A, survival, B, how do I play nice with the powers that be so that I don't get kicked out? And the last thing you're really thinking about is, what do I think? What do I really think? Not what does my leader think, not what does the company line tell me I should do, but what do I, as a sovereign individual, if I had agency, which I don't always, what would I think or do? And so that unlearning is, okay, what silence did I learn? What of it do I want to keep? Because frankly, silence can be a useful survival strategy at times for people, particularly subordinated identities. So I'm not saying just throw out all that you've learned and say whatever you think whenever you want. That's unrealistic. But if you don't interrogate what's there, you're building on shaky ground. And so the unlearning is really sifting through, what did I learn? What serves me? What served me in the past that I might not want to keep? What do I still want to continue to implement because I believe in it? I believe in it, not I was taught and I regurgitate it. And you'll notice that I use the phrase unlearning because it is an ongoing process. So we're never done with it. Life is too complicated for us to be done with it. We are constantly making choices day in and day out of what is my voice? What power do I have? What agency do I have? But until we interrogate what's there, I think we really are living on autopilot of that conditioning and things that we've learned. So the unlearning is a necessary, often painful, but necessary step.
You know, there's something I'm thinking of because I've seen it happen so often. And I wonder, how can you and I talk to it for just a minute to help that person who intellectually will hear what's being said, but their ego goes, oh, I do that already. And so mentally they check that off, like they don't need to engage further with it. Do they have to get all the way down to bone pain in order to shift? Or how can people like yourself and myself help those people who are in the community that will listen to this conversation and they'll stay up here instead of going down here where it'll be?
I love it. 3 ideas, because I think there are 3 different aspects that we all need to be interrogating. And given our different intersectional identities, our relationship with silence is going to be different. Frankly, I would argue that in the United States, there is half of the population that does not struggle with being silenced or having learned silence. When I first started out writing this book, my husband, who is a white cis man from Minnesota, was like, that's not a book I could write, because he has never been told that his voice isn't welcome. Now, being married to me, he gets a big earful about the inequity in the world and what people who look and sound like me deal with as a first-gen immigrant, female, Asian American, the list goes on. So the 3 areas that I would interrogate, and I think this is a framework for someone who's like, I already do that. Still worth asking the questions. Number 1, in what ways might I silence myself? And maybe you don't at all. Maybe you have never had to wrestle with the question of, should I say this, should I not say this? Good for you. To which I would say, then, in what ways do you underestimate the challenge for people who are not like you? Because what I hope what you take from this is there is at least one person maybe two, one named Elaine Lin Hering, another named Michelle Price, who has been silenced and has experienced that. So if you haven't, I hope you are walking away with greater awareness that this might be true for some of the people around you who don't look and sound like you and don't have the same life experiences. Second is the question that we should all be asking, not just in what ways am I silencing myself, but in what ways might I be silencing the people around me? Because that's a big one. From the way that we hold meetings to the way that we communicate. If you have power and you are used to having your voice heard, then you tend to design communication patterns that serve you. Meaning, you're really used to communicating directly. You prefer real-time conversation rather than asynchronous communication. You assume that there should be no ums and everybody should talk in 3 succinct bullet points. That is one dominant norm of communication that is normalized through corporate America and prized and elevated, and everybody else needs to fit into that mold, or you don't have leadership's potential or executive presence.
And professional speakers.
Sure. Notice that I'm also using 3 points here because I'm acknowledging the reality of the world we live in. But what does that model, whose voices does that model support? Whose model does, and that standard, whose voices does that standard silence? Often neurodivergent folks, people who communicate more clearly, strong people who are post-processors, people who communicate better in writing rather than speaking. The list goes on. So even with our best intentions to say, I'm super approachable, I'm always here, just come talk to me. That hurdle to come talk to you in the way that you prefer, at the time that you prefer, you are creating so many hurdles for me to even begin to have the conversation with you. And so again, it's not for lack of good intention, but to be asking, in what ways might I unintentionally be silencing the very people I claim to support or in our personal lives love? I'll give you the third, just because we need to talk in 3 points, and then I know we'll circle back. And the third is, what culture am I contributing to on my team or in my family? So if number 1 was silencing myself, number 2 is ways I'm silencing other people, number 3 is what's the culture? Because employee silence, organizational silence is this long studied body of academic work where employees don't speak up, they don't tell you the problems until it's too late, whistleblowers get penalized, I mean, all of these things, but that is built in a culture either of silence or of voice. When we talk about psychological safety, it's who is going to have to absorb the costs of using their voice. And if the costs are too high, you are incentivizing silence. And the one thing that we know is that silence breeds silence. So if I look around and no one else is saying anything, I assume that that's what we do around here. Versus I look around and I hear Michelle and I hear Jing and I hear Artie speaking, using their voices, sharing different perspectives, and no one gets hurt. Oh, voice breeds voice. So in what ways are my choices contributing to the dominant culture of how we communicate, how we work, how we exist on our team, in our companies, in our communities? And for anyone who says, but I don't have enough power, I don't really matter, how many of us have sat in meetings where we all saw it going down and no one said anything? Versus even just saying, hold on, can we pause here? Or I see it differently. Or here's the question I'm wondering about, to say something rather than to do nothing. And that's where silence as violence, particularly white violence, comes into play. Because you have more privilege and are more able to bear the costs, if there are costs to you at all, because your voice is more accepted anyways, and you choose not to do it, you are contributing to that culture of silence.
I'm thinking as I'm listening and absorbing what you're saying, that you somewhat talked to what I wanted to bring up in 3, but I'm also wondering in the 3rd question, I should clarify, but I'm also wondering by by what you just shared now, how if I went ahead and asked that question anyway, might deliver us a different layer of understanding. So totally agree. Silence usually indicates people are not willing to have the hard conversation. And can we really have hard conversations at work and not end up in being in HR or being fired? That is the thing that I hear most often from people. Well, we need to have more hard conversations, but I'm not willing to get punished for it.
Yeah.
And because startups usually, I mean, they're early stage, so they don't even
you don't have HR.
Yeah. And so I want to bring this up to allow them to start, especially as founders are starting to bring on team members, allowing them to start thinking about how they're creating that culture so that they're able to have an effective culture that can continue to grow instead of not knowing and then having that piece of their foundation end up becoming a sinkhole later on.
Absolutely. And sinkhole is such a great analogy because you don't know when it's going to fall through. It's super dangerous. You need caution tape around it. It's going to happen. And as founders, you have enough stuff to worry about. You don't need that liability hanging over your head. I love what you said, and I think it gives us our answer, which is in corporate context or traditional corporate context, if I have the hard conversation, then I'm going to get punished. Why is that always linked to it? Why does being punished have to be the way? I'd argue that some of that is scar tissue, right, from school or from our families, that when we tried to have a conversation, then we got our hands slapped, literally or figuratively. And so that is our assumption. But this is where if you're a founder and you're building something, you have the opportunity. Can you actually decouple those things? That having the hard conversation could just be, oh, we had a hard conversation. And it was hard because it was awkward. It was hard because it had emotions. It was hard because I didn't have time for it. It was hard because I didn't want to talk about it. But we did it. And you as a leader, but I would say leader is anyone in the conversation, can also do sort of the pre-work of saying, I'm not really looking forward to having this conversation, but I know it's important for us to do it so it doesn't come to bite us later. Have the conversation. Again, going back to what we said earlier, own where you're imperfect, own where you get triggered. If you have that self-awareness of, I'm not my finest self right now, and then design a way that supports both your voice and communication strengths and the other parties, meaning it doesn't have to be solved all in a 30-minute Zoom meeting. Conflict, differences of perspective don't fit nicely in a slot on our calendar. So are there questions that you share? Do you talk through some of it and then say, let's pause, let's sleep on it, come back to it in 2 days, 2 weeks? Just give it some air. Let the adrenaline come down.
Yeah.
And at the end of the conversation, demonstrate appreciation, right? Michelle, thank you. That was awkward. That was hard. I know that's not how we really wanted to spend our time or our day, but I'm so grateful that you were willing to lean in. And in there's no punishment. The other framework I would offer, particularly as a founder, because I think as founders, we struggle with, okay, how much input do I actually want? Right? I'm supposed to be open-minded. I'm supposed to be receptive to feedback. There's all these norms, but I am just inundated by, I can't take it anymore. I don't want any more opinions. Oh, but if I'm building a new team and bringing someone on, I'm supposed to consult. I'm supposed to care what they think. And for me, the intellectual honesty of where and when I'm going to accept and be interested in input is supremely useful for myself in managing the information flow, and for the people on my team to know where to lean in and where to push. And so the construct that I use most in coaching is one of three buckets. Who goes in what bucket? In every decision, there are people who are not going to be part of the decision. They're just going to be informed. Right? I'm going to figure it out. I'm going to talk it out. I'm going to tell you what the decision is, and then we'll implement it. The second bucket is consult. I'm going to consult you. I'm going to ask you what you think, because you are the data scientist. You are the one closer to Indigenous folks. Whatever it is, I am consulting you, asking you for your opinion, but let's not confuse that with a third bucket, which is who decides. And consult and decide is where I see the most friction, because we don't offer clarity from the get-go. We don't say, I am consulting you, and then I will make the decision. And so this person leans in, advises, thinks that they are a joint decision maker when they're not, and then gets jaded and is like, if you already knew what you're going to do, why did we go through the theatrics of having the conversation? When from the get-go, it's, oh, I hold the decision. Or, you know what? I don't own the decision. Our CTO owns the decision. Or, you know, I don't own the decision. You own it. But as the founder, I want to be consulted. So inform, consult, decide. You know, there are lots of different frameworks. RACI is another one of them, or permutations. But that clarity in what role am I playing right now allows us to show up and play that role well, and then not get offended when we're not the decision maker or not included, because the reality is that the world can't run on consensus. And particularly as you scale, you can no longer operate on consensus. And frankly, even co-founders shouldn't necessarily be operating on consensus on everyday decisions. You can't work quickly like that. So knowing what bucket you're in for what topic helps set those expectations, and then decouple it from punishment. Because remember, we were flawed human beings that are human, that are all trying our best. And we're going to own when we mess up.
I'm going to insert one more thing here.
Yeah.
Because I've observed it so many times over the years. This is also where I'm going to challenge my colleagues, especially the founders, the co-founders who are cis white males.
Yeah.
To be asking yourself these questions and asking, what is my level of awareness as I'm approaching these conversations? Because so often I see them operate from their rewarded ego. Word, like what is it called? Gravity. Their gravity of ego really misinforms their choices and their decisions, and they aren't even able to put they. And I love the fact that you said intellectually honest, because you and I share a lot of a language. And so often they are not being intellectually honest.
Yeah. Let me put a different take on it, slightly different take, because I think ego can be triggering. And for those of us who care about good identities, I'm humble. I'm a servant leader. That's just who I am. And I think there's a utilitarian perspective to homogeneity, particularly in the startup phase. I feel like I was just an academic throwing about big words. So let me unpack that. What I mean by that is, look, when you're bootstrapped or you're tired or you're trying to move quickly, the easiest thing to do is hire and work with people who look and sound like you. Because there's an ease in terms of norms and behaviors. There's a code, which is why other people need to code switch. Now, even if we know that all the research tells us that diverse teams outperform, are more creative in the long run, are more innovative in the long run, we are battling as human beings that short-term, long-term trade-off. And when I'm bootstrapped and just trying to get things off the ground, I'm not looking for the long-term payoff, even though I am. The other thing is sameness, homogeneity also covers up wrongs. And there's a whole bunch of research around that because people aren't going to see that it's an issue. People aren't going to report it. It's too costly because you're my friend, right? You are my sister's boyfriend or whoever is in the club. So I'm less likely to actually tell you, which is how we end up with the Enrons and so many other things of the world. So I have a more compassionate take maybe than ego, because it is costly to do something that is potentially uncomfortable, that is different, that means that I have to learn. Oh, and now you're telling me to unlearn too. I don't have time for that. I just need to get this venture off the ground. So my challenge would be, I totally agree with you with awareness. And I think the advice of hire people who are different than you, who bring different superpowers, then you exponentially are stronger together, hire for difference rather than sameness. And to acknowledge that it's uncomfortable, right? It is more costly in the short term to figure out how to work with someone who is different than me than to work with someone who is a lot more like me. I personally think it's worth it in the short term and the long term, but I want to acknowledge that I don't think it's just about ego. I think it's about convenience, and I think it is about efficiency in the short term. And I don't want founders to lose out on the long term.
Yeah. Well, we have had a very profound, deep conversation today that I think what's going to happen is people are going to need to listen to this over and over. Because I can even say my own neurodivergent brain would benefit from listening to it over and over again.
Well, and if I can offer, for those of us who don't learn best by listening, I have written a book for those who prefer to consume by reading. It'll be out March 2024. I'm sure we can link to pre-order it. But I really want to invite us into this process of challenging ourselves, not just for the impact that it has for the people around us, even though I care about that, but for ourselves as founders, as human beings. Are we living the way that we want to? Are we building for the long term and the short term? Are we building things that are going to last, that are meaningful? Because as humans, we have one life to live. So I want us to live that fully. That's what this is about.
And a reminder for those who are listening to go back to the event description, because you're going to be able to connect with Elaine there. There's going to be links to her LinkedIn, and you can literally find everything on her LinkedIn. She will definitely be communicating about when the book's out, and that's also an excellent way to reach out to her and see if you want to work with her as well. Thoroughly enjoyed this conversation today. I knew it was going to be a powerful one. We're very grateful that you agreed to come on and share your genius with us and stimulate our thoughts and our questions so that we can show up as better founders or even better investors, so that we can have the kind of impact that we really want in this world. I mean, we're literally in some pretty interesting pivotal points.
Yes.
Right now.
Yes, if we continue on autopilot, we may not all be here. That's how high the stakes are. So thank you for having me. Thank you for allowing me to join the Startup Grind chapter for a bit. And I'll look forward to staying connected.